it was the Prime Minister who announced yesterday, and it caught many people by surprise. Yesterday when the Prime Minister spoke and he announced that 100% consensus has been achieved, it must have caught many people by surprise. But Rishabh has now given you the inside track of how the behind-the-scenes negotiations carried on for days altogether before this was achieved. Listen in.
एक खुशखबरी मिली है हमारी टीम्स के हार्डवर्क से और आप सभी के सहयोग से नई दिल्ली G20 लीडर्स समिट डिक्लेरेशन पर सहमति बनी है कि इस लीडर्स डिक्लेरेशन को भी एडॉप्ट किया जाए। मैं इस डिक्लेरेशन को एडॉप्ट करने की घोषणा करता हूं।
Let me go across to the guests also joining us now. Dr. Alexey Kuprianov, head at the Center of the Indian Ocean Region, Abhijit Iyer Mitra, Senior Fellow at the IPCS, and Sushant Sareen, Senior Fellow at the ORF. Were you, Dr. Kuprianov, taken by surprise? The larger commentary always was that a Delhi consensus would be very elusive, if not impossible.
First of all, thank you for the invitation. And secondly, firstly, I would like to congratulate my Indian friends on the success of summit. India has shown that it is a responsible great power, and as it was many centuries ago before the colonial conquest. And secondly, Russia views this resolution, this declaration. It's not pro-Russian, of course, but we are pleased that it's not pro-Ukrainian and not pro-Western. I am not personally not surprised because, in fact, I was sure that Indian leadership would be able to, to reach the decision, to reach the agreement between opposite parts, between parts of, we understand that members of G20 have absolutely different position on the Ukrainian crisis. But, under the Indian leadership, the final declaration was inevitable.
Final declaration was inevitable. Little bit of heartburn you sense in the kind of columns that are being written right now, Sushant Sareen?
That's inevitable, isn't it? There are people who will continue to make carping sounds, regardless of whether you have a successful document and you have a consensus document or you don't. You have a consensus document, there are carping sounds. If you did not have one, you just had an outcome statement, there would have been carping sounds. You remember, Padmaja, there have been meetings, I think it was the finance ministers and a couple of other meetings, where you could not come up with a consensus document. And you came up with either an outcome statement or a statement of intention or whatever diplomatese is used in these kind of circumstances. And the usual suspects came up with, their own write-ups. But I think what is important is the kind of diplomatic skill that has been brought to bear, not just by the Prime Minister, but also by the Ministry of External Affairs and the Indian diplomats, but also the fact that the diplomats of other countries and the leadership of other countries were also ready to compromise. They all started with maximalist positions. They all started watering it down and came up with a consensus document that everybody can live with. I think it is important to understand that G20, and this is not something that, I'm making up, but this is something which has already been there in documents and in statements. G20 is essentially an economic grouping, but of course, a lot of other agendas also get tagged on to economics. And to then allow such an important grouping to be deviated, distracted, deflected by a particular war which is taking place, which is also having an impact on the global economy. I think it would be a kind of counterproductive to allow the war which is happening between Russia and Ukraine to derail everything else in the globe. So what you had to do was to find some kind of a middle ground, to find something with which everybody could live so that the rest of the agenda could be pushed forward. And I think that is what the Indian diplomats have achieved, and all kudos to them for having done that. In my book, and I think in any person who thinks with his head, screwed on straight, and head, placed right and not in unmentionable places, it's very clear that it's been a resounding success, this summit.
And when handing over the presidency, the Prime Minister also said that further reforms are needed and that we now need to have next virtual summits as well. What do you make, Abhijit, of the Prime Minister's personal stamp on the way this entire summit has gone? In the morning today, when we were speaking to people in government, they said that it was he personally who decided that, listen, these are the deliverables that we have to get at the end of 48 hours. Come what may. As somebody who's observed him over the last 9 years, what is this whole Modi ka magic, Modi ki guarantee that is being spoken of?
Padmaja, will you permit me a little bit of gossipy viciousness for a while?
100%. We are always willing to listen to some vicious gossip.
Okay.
But
excellent.
parliamentary.
Of course, always parliamentary. The first thing about Modi is he's a fantastic consensus builder. This is where the Modi bear hug comes in. Everybody makes fun of him. Oh, you go around hugging people and things like that. The problem is once somebody is very warm and effusive to you, when you're stuck on a negotiating point, how do you continue saying no, 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 no? It increases the pain point of that no. Which is why, even though, look at the wording on the Russia-Ukraine war. The West would have optimally wanted a one-sided condemnation of Russia. That did not happen. Instead, what has happened is a generic condemnation on principles of territorial sovereignty and integrity, which could just as easily have been applied to America in Libya, America in Syria, to America in Kosovo and Serbia, etc., etc., etc. So, it's been handled very well. But coming to the vicious gossipy part, there were 3-4 big losers in this entire thing. The first was Justin Trudeau. Did you notice the complete media blackout of Justin Trudeau and the cold shoulder he got from everyone?
Absolutely. In fact, I think the only time that he really had some individual, footage to himself, one was yesterday when the Prime Minister was greeting everyone, and today at Rajghat. Barely in any of the official pictures released is he there.
Exactly. And mind you, when the biofuels part was announced, if you could show the images from the biofuels announcement, Canada was a observer out there, and yet Canada was the only country, because you can very prominently see the Canadian flag displayed below, and yet Trudeau was not invited to that particular event. He wasn't invited to the India, Middle East, Europe corridor event either, even though you'd say, well, it doesn't go through America, but Joe Biden was right there to sit and shepherd it. The second, there have been 2-3 people like that who have not been given any media coverage whatsoever, I suspect quite deliberately. One is the Chinese Prime Minister, Li Keqiang. Then there's been Recep Tayyip Erdogan as well, though he's going to have his press conference. He's always a bit off the rocker. So let's see what he does today at his press conference. That's going to be fun. And notice something very important. It was after. Everybody's very curious. Why was the Delhi Declaration released somewhere in the middle of the conference? Why was it not released at the end of the conference as it normally is? Because you got the consensus, and then suddenly out of nowhere, you pull these 2 rabbits out of your hat. The corridor to oppose China after getting China's consensus on the draft declaration. And then
for the benefit of our viewers, let's quickly tell them what is this, the picture that he was referring to where Justin Trudeau was conspicuous by his absence. It was at the launch of the Global Biofuels Alliance, and that is the picture, the official picture that was released. And here you basically have Prime Minister Modi at the center. You've got Lula da Silva to his either side. You have Lula da Silva, you have Joe Biden, you have Giorgia Meloni, you have Sheikh Hasina. And you're right, he is nowhere here despite the fact that you've got Canada's flag. Ironically, right next to Prime Minister Modi, you see Canada's flag, but you don't see the head of Canada anywhere in the picture. Carry on,
Right.
Abhijit.
So this is the other lovely thing about Modi. You see, revenge is a dish served cold. So, like a Russian vinaigrette salad that has to be in the fridge for a while, or like a good French stew that takes 48 hours to cook slowly to loosen up the chicken in the wine and all the roasting juices. He's served it out nice and cold, and I don't think Trudeau's going away with his plumage much intact. He's going
But on a
back
serious
something of a
note, on a
black
serious
chicken.
note, why? Why do you think this message was sent out to Justin Trudeau?
I think he's crossed several lines very frequently, a bit too often. He's been supporting now, it's become open and blatant support of Khalistani terrorism in India. It has been outright interference in India's internal affairs. Remember, during the farmers' protests, there was no need for him to poke his nose in. We did a lot less to the farmers than he himself did to his truckers. And yet here he was supporting the right to free protest, as if anybody was crashing down. And those weren't even free protests; those were riots. Let's be clear about that.
And the fact, because we are having a working lunch, and these are the pictures coming out. We have a working lunch happening with Emmanuel Macron. This, of course, are the pictures from earlier Rishi Sunak and Prime Minister Modi meeting. We are told that a working lunch is about to just start between Emmanuel Macron and the Prime Minister. And Sushant Sareen, today, when he met with Rishi Sunak, the issue of Khalistan, that is the other red line, the fact that consistently Indian establishments in Canada have been attacked, have been defaced, temples, places of worship have been defaced, Khalistani propaganda has been scribbled across them. Is it that the Indian government is not entirely satisfied with the kind of response that it's got from Canada on these issues?
It's not just not satisfied. I think the Indian government is furious over how the Canadians have been handling this. Because it's not just the defacing of temples, and that's certainly not acceptable. It's not just the assaulting of Indian or people of Indian origin out there by these Khalistani scum and their Pakistani partners, because many of the finances for these guys come from the Pakistanis. It is the fact that Indian diplomats have not only been threatened, but there have been instances where the physical harm could have come to them. And yet, if you have Canadian authorities try and brush all this under the carpet, it is simply not acceptable. In any other country, they would have been held to pay. For the Canadians to pretend that, this is freedom of speech when you glorify terrorism, when you glorify the assassination of an Indian leader, Mrs. Gandhi, and this is just freedom of expression. Would the Canadians have allowed Al-Qaeda supporters in Canada, and there are plenty of them because Mr. Trudeau has brought a lot of them into Canada, would they allow them to carry out, this kind of floats with imagery of the Twin Towers being brought down and glorification of the terrorists responsible for 9/11? Do you think that could have ever been allowed? But yet you allow the glorification of terrorists who assassinated Mrs. Gandhi, and there is absolutely no reaction from the Canadian side. How is that acceptable? And okay, even that one could have said, okay, fine, let's just ignore this. But when you start threatening Indian diplomats and you are about, and there have been instances where Indian diplomats have literally escaped by the skin of their teeth from being assaulted. And if there is no action taken against those Khalistani scum, then clearly there will be a pushback from the Indian side. What do the Canadians expect? And look, I personally, Padmaja, I find it very tragic because I think Canadians are wonderful people. Most Canadians, Trudeau and others accept, you leave them out. But and there is every reason for India and Canada to be great friends. There is a lot we have in common with the Canadians. But this kind of behavior is simply not acceptable. Now you juxtapose what the Canadians are doing with how Rishi Sunak is behaving, right? He is not saying that, look, I'm not going to do anything about the Khalistanis. Whether he does or not, we'll see. But at least he's professed the intention to not let this go out of hand. In Canada's case, these terrorists have actually killed people. They have been responsible for mass murder, which the Canadians have covered up.
And yet they are being lionized. We were told when we were kids that in diplomacy, what is left unsaid is as important, if not more, than what is said. Apparently now people who are left unseen are also as important in sending across a message as those who are seen, clearly, from what we see in the last 24 hours. Taking a very, very quick break at this point. We return on the other side, talking about what the Prime Minister said today when he was handing over the presidency of G20 and how does one parse that statement. Back in a minute. It would interest you to know, Abhijit, that apparently there is going to be a small pull aside between Prime Minister Modi and Justin Trudeau in a bit. But I also want to talk about the very significant visuals we saw today. Rishi Sunak, of course, the issue of Khalistan is going to be one of the main issues on the table. The other issue is the pictures we saw of him from today morning. Made it a point to go to Akshardham.
Right. So, look, the pull aside is this last minute meeting, no real agenda. It's more like, when you can't avoid, unfortunately, when there's a fly or a mosquito trying to get to your cake, you have to kind of swat it off every now and then. I don't consider that a summit meeting between the person who's eating the cake and the mosquito in question. So, the less said about that, the better. As for Rishi Sunak, I've always been extremely skeptical. On one hand, he's very proud of his religion, which is perfectly fine. The problem is it severely hinders his ability to act on issues regarding Hindus in the UK. Remember the Leicester riots against Hindus started off when this man was Prime Minister. He did diddly squat. He was sitting there knitting a sweater or God knows what, doing nothing, did not open his mouth even once about it. Yesterday, again, what has happened is one of the instigators of those particular riots, a chap called Majid Freeman, has been dog whistling and targeting a community that raised a Hanuman flag in Leicester again. The community has had to apologize and put out explanations, and Rishi Sunak is busy here, gallivanting around with his wife, getting all these plaudits without getting any critical feedback on his protection of minorities back in his own country, specifically his own specific minority. So, I take all this, I take people both who wear their brown skin and people who get these cheap bandgalas from Manyavar to do Bhangra dance in public with a huge bucket of salt.
But on a serious note, Sushant Sareen, what exactly is the politics behind this? I mean, it's great that he's embracing his roots, etc. He speaks of Janmashtami, temple, Jai Siya Ram, all of that. But there has to be a political interest behind it. Is really the Hindu vote in Britain so large that somebody would so overtly reach out to them?
No, I don't think it is. I think it's more personal rather than political. There could be some element of politics in it, but it's not a critical element. I think it's more of a personal element, partly because, look at it this way, Padmaja, the Hindu vote in Britain is divided. A lot of it has now started going to the Tories, but a bulk of it still goes to the Labour. I don't know whether that will be the case in the next election, because that vote has started shifting. But then when you add the votes of some of the Khalistanis, or in fact all the Khalistanis, and I'm certainly distinguishing between normal Sikhs who are loyal, patriotic Indians and have nothing to do with these Khalistani scum, but I'm also talking about the Khalistanis who are present in significant numbers in Britain. And then, of course, that entire Mirpuri scum community in Britain, which is rabidly anti-Hindu, rabidly anti-India, and very violent. In fact, they are rabidly anti-Britain. But they have been pandered to by the Labour Party. It's become a kind of a captive vote bank of the Labour Party, and it's a fairly large number of votes they have. I don't have the exact numbers, but it's a fairly large, and they do influence elections in more than 2 or 3 dozen constituencies. So I don't think the politics of it is that critical.
Okay.
If there are additional Hindu votes coming to the Tories, it certainly helps. But does it sway an election? I'm not entirely sure of it. So I think in the case of Rishi Sunak, to give him credit, he is not like a Bobby Jindal or some of those other characters who try and hide their heritage, and they think that, if they take on another identity, they can hide the fact of their origins or their heritage and their culture and traditions. So he's not apologetic about it. And
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Sushant, but there's news just coming in. We are being told that the India-France bilateral is just beginning. Defense ties, space cooperation are being discussed. What more? Over to you, Rishabh. Give us details.
Definitely, the first bilateral has done, and India and France are now meeting. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is meeting Emmanuel Macron, the French president, over a working lunch. On agenda is definitely the defense ties. Remember, we have been talking about 36 Rafale Marines, 26 Rafale Marines for that matter, to be bought for Indian Navy. There are other submarine deals as well, the P-7 submarine deals that we are discussing with France. So the defense ties are being discussed. After Chandrayaan-3, everyone wants to associate with ISRO, and that's also on agenda between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Emmanuel Macron. The space cooperation between India and France is being discussed. A working lunch is happening, and post this, we'll hear from Emmanuel Macron as well. A press conference by the French president is scheduled between 2:30 and 3:30. There also we'll hear what his experience at G20 was, how he looks at the New Delhi declaration, and how things for India, France look ahead. But for now, the all-important bilateral meeting of the day has begun over working lunch between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and French President Emmanuel Macron.
Okay, Mr. Kuprianov, in fact, speaking of Macron, he's been rather critical of Russia to the extent that he said that the Russian flag has no place in the French Olympics.
Sorry? So about Russia you mean Russian presence in Africa or something else? Awfully sorry, madam. I couldn't hear Macron's
my
speech.
question to you was, we were just talking about the bilateral between India and France beginning, and I recall just a couple of days ago when he was asked about, Russian athletes' participation in the Olympics, he said the flag of Russia has no place in the Olympics because of the way that they are treating even children.
I cannot comment that. I'm awfully sorry, madam.
I understand. Okay, there's more, in fact, news coming in. The United States has reacted to the Delhi Declaration, hailing the Delhi Declaration. And not just that, they have also made some comments about what it says about Russia. US President Joe Biden is engaging countries around the world to push for peace in the Russia-Ukraine war on the basis of principles of the UN Charter in New Delhi G20 declaration. That is a major step forward. However, the principal deputy national security advisor at the White House said that there is an unprecedented unified statement on the imperative that Russia refrains from using force for territorial acquisition. This is what the White House has said. Your reaction, Mr. Kuprianov?
So first of all, our main idea here in Russia is that every conflict ends in peace, and so this world must be more just than it was before, so it's our first thinking. The second is that so the main problem when Western countries tries to lecture you, it's the position that, okay, you are the first in the world who use the force for your political goals. Because of course, we remember American invasion in Iraq, American operation in Afghanistan, and so on, so on, so on. So the main problem, and the third problem, yes, for us, that here in Russia, the main part of population sees the goals of this conflict as quite as just. Well, because for us, it's not the aggression against independent country. Well, because the main part of Ukrainians who are living here in Ukraine and main part of Russians remember the time when Ukraine was not an independent country and was just part of bigger Soviet Union. So for us, it's maybe something like a postponed civil war in our country. So for us, it's just restoration of maybe just order, just international order on the Eurasian space. And thank you for lecture, Mr. Biden. We understand, we understand your idea. We support the idea that all resolutions should be resolved peacefully, but after 8 years of Ukrainian shelling on the Donetsk region, I think it's not so possible as you think.
All right. I'm going to take a very quick break. Is this also, in a sense, preparation by the U.S. to prepare for their domestic audience? Because, well, they will be pilloried, Sushant Sareen, saying, how could you agree to this language in the joint declaration when very clearly you had said that Russia should unequivocally be condemned? But that hasn't happened.
Look, again, I think there will be a section of people who will, pick on the text of the joint statement and try and create some controversy over it. The thing is that if you have to come up with a consensus document, then it has to be a document everybody can live with. And I think the brilliance of this particular document is that everyone can interpret it, in a way that it serves their own interests. Like the Americans have done. And nobody can say that the American interpretation is wrong. The Russians can interpret it the way they want to interpret it. And as Abhijit at the outset had said, that the Russians can say that, look, you're talking about the principles of, non-interference, non-aggression, etc., whatever else are the terms.
I think Sergei Lavrov is just speaking right now.
The G20 is essentially about the global south wanting to strengthen its role in global governance mechanisms so that they adequately reflect its share in global affairs, including in the economy, where BRICS has already surpassed the G7 countries in terms of their GDP. The declaration outlines the tasks of reforming the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Frankly speaking, if we take an honest look on quotas and those, the Americans wouldn't have had the blocking veto power that is preserved artificially. This summit will give a positive impetus to the effort to reform the IMF, the World Trade Organization. This is something the declaration stipulates directly. These efforts are hindered by the United States and its allies. In the same vein, an emphasis is placed on the need for the West to comply with its years-long promises that have been undelivered on, including on technology transfer. There is a very clear cut-out task, and the developing countries will not tolerate being put before the false choice, fighting poverty or investing into climate change. This is a false alternative, and naturally, the tasks of social and economic development take precedence. The declaration also stipulates the need to deliver on the promises to transfer technologies to the global south countries, not only exporting commodity materials and then receiving costs from added value. The West also has long ago promised giving $100 billion per year to prepare economies to counter the negative consequences of the climate change. nothing of that has been done. The declaration also mentions all those tasks that need to be done in accordance with the long-standing promises in order to ensure a balance of interests in the global economy. It is a long way to go, but this summit has been a milestone from the point of view of giving a clear guiding star for us to follow. Another thing I would like to mention in particular is the active role of the Indian presidency that has genuinely consolidated the G20 members, probably for the first time in its history. I mean the G20 countries from the global south. Our BRICS partners, Brazil, India, China, South Africa, have been particularly active. And thanks to this consolidated position taken by the global south countries to uphold and protect their legitimate interests, have caused the West to be unable to Ukrainize the agenda to the detriment of the discussion of the tasks facing developing countries. We call it the Ukrainian paragraph. It is part of the consensus, but it's not about Ukraine. Yes, the Ukrainian crisis is mentioned, but only in the context of the need to settle all conflicts that exist in the world and settle those conflicts in accordance with all the principles of the United Nations Charter in their fullness and interconnectedness. As you know, as soon as we start talking about Ukraine, the West is unable to maintain an intelligent discussion. All it can do is demand that Russia stop its aggression and restore Ukraine's territorial integrity. But the United Nations Charter also mentioned, after the principle of sovereignty, the principle of equality and self-determination of the people. When we explained it to our colleagues, and we have been talking behind the scenes a lot, when in February 2014 a coup d'etat took place in Kiev and putschists came into power, the first thing they did was declare that they wanted to eliminate the Russian language as another state language. That was what triggered the inhabitants of Crimea and the Donbass. They were unhappy about it. They said they didn't want to live in such a country. This attitude to their own country is what took Kiev to undermine its own territorial integrity, because the UNGA declaration about the principles of international law says that it is necessary to respect the territorial integrity of countries whose governments respect the principle of self-determination of peoples and represent the entirety of the population of the country. In February 2014, the putschists can hardly be considered to be powers representing the interests of Crimeans and the inhabitants of the east of Ukraine. That goes without saying. No need to even prove it. So the Kiev regime destroyed the territorial integrity of its country with its own hand. Therefore, in full compliance with the UN Charter and the international law, the principle of self-determination of peoples came into play. This is something we have explained a lot, many times, and the correct understanding of what is going on is apparent amid the developing countries in the G20. I believe that some of our Western colleagues understand it too, but you know very well that we are placing